Well, I think we'll get underway now. My name is Jennifer. I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of myself and on behalf of my colleague, Dr. Tim Bowley, and Monash Law School and the Centre for Commercial Law and Regulatory Studies. Today's seminar really covers a topic that I think is one of the most controversial issues in corporate law at the moment. And that is the question of whether corporate law is basically about making money for shareholders and to what extent it should encompass broader social issues. Now, that question affects a whole range of different actors in the corporate scenario. It affects what directors should be doing, and it also affects regulators. And just yesterday, I read an opinion piece in the Washington Post where C. Boyden Gray, a former White House counsel, was basically criticising the SEC for straying from its primary mission of ensuring that shareholders make money and don't lose money through fraud by introducing rules about disclosure on climate change risk. So this is an issue that really underpins all areas of corporate law at the moment. But in today's seminar, we're going to be looking at the more fundamental issue of what do shareholders or what do the ultimate investors themselves want when it comes to these social issues. And particularly, are they prepared to sacrifice profitability to ensure social goals? Well, to present today's seminar, we're very fortunate to have Associate Professor Scott Hirst from Boston University Law School. Scott is an expert in this area. He started out as an Aussie. I don't know, maybe you're still an Aussie, Scott. He has a commerce degree and a law degree from the University of Queensland. He then went on to Harvard, where he did his postgraduate studies, and he has an LLM and a Doctor of Juridical Studies from Harvard Law School. He also served as research director of the program on institutional investors at Harvard. What I didn't know was that he practiced for 7 years at Shearman and Sterling in New York in the M&A area, and he joined Boston University School of Law in 2018 and has been writing up a storm in this area ever since. So welcome, Scott. I know it's good evening to you there and it's good morning to all of you in Australia. Our commentator today is going to be Dean Paatsch. Dean is very well known in Australia and particularly in Melbourne, where he works in the area with ownership matters. Dean, in 2003, co-founded Proxy Australia, which was a boutique proxy voting advisory service right at the beginning of these sort of advisory services for institutional investors. It went through a number of iterations, risk metrics, ISS governance services, and Dean was there leading the charge in this area. In an earlier lifetime, he was a commercial lawyer and he was founding CEO of the Australian Institute of Superannuation Trustees. So we're going to get underway. Scott is going to tell us about his research in this area. He'll be speaking for around 30 minutes. We'll then follow up with Dean's commentary and then we'll open it up for a free-for-all. Now, if any members of the audience would like to send us through questions, we'd love to receive them. Please use the Q&A box on your screen. And if you could please just identify yourself and identify the organisation for which you work, that would be terrific. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. So over to you, Scott. Thanks so much for doing this today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jennifer. Let me make sure my slide sharing works. Can everyone now see my slides? I hope that's a yes.
That is a yes.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you, Jennifer and Tim, for having me. Thank you, Dean, for your willingness to comment on this paper. This is co-authored work with Kobe Castile and Tammy Cricelli-Katz, both at the University of Tel Aviv. And I should say, this is in some ways, it's a world premiere. This is the first time that I'm presenting the whole paper. We've just finished it in time for this presentation. So very excited about that. I hope the Dean will also go easy on me a little bit because it's the first time. And the paper is really about this very question that we have in the title. How much do investors care about social responsibility? And what I would like to do is first talk about why investor preferences matter. And that really means talking about the current debate about corporate social responsibility. Then I'd like to talk through the research questions that we investigate in the paper, talk about how we study them, what we find, and the implications that we believe follow from our research. So first up, why do investor preferences matter? And so at the moment, there are three important debates taking place. One about this question of what is or what should be a company's purpose. Second one about how a corporation should be thinking about its stakeholders, and then a more general debate that's been happening for some time regarding corporate social responsibility. And we think that all of these debates are really addressing the same problem, and we wrap them up under this heading of the corporate social responsibility debate. And the question we think that they're addressing is, to what extent should corporate leaders promote social interests? And we think it goes further just than corporate leaders and also extends to investment managers that manage the funds of individuals and families putting their money into the stock markets and into companies. So to do this, I want to do a quick thumbnail sketch of some of the positions in this debate and tell you where our research fits into it. So we'll start, our first thumbnail is Milton Friedman, who in 1970 kind of staked out and articulated very clearly the position that companies should maximize returns for investors, saying that the only social responsibility of business is to increase its profits, provided that it stays within the rules of the game created by general legislation and regulations. Fast forward to 2 years ago, to the Business Roundtable, led at the time by Jamie Dimon, puts forward a statement that reconceives in its view the purpose of the corporation and says that each of the stakeholders is essential to the corporation, and Jamie and other CEOs of large US companies commit to deliver value to all of them on the belief that the future success of the companies depend on that, as well as communities and country. So he's really taking the position that promoting social interests maximizes returns for investors. And in this, he was joined by Larry Fink, the chairman and CEO of BlackRock, who made clear his view and BlackRock's view that companies must not only deliver financial performance, but also show how they contribute to society. They must benefit all of their stakeholders. And of course, this debate isn't particularly new. In 1931, Adolph Burley had written that business corporations exist for the sole purpose of making profits for their stockholders, very similar to the Friedman view. And he entered into a debate with Merrick Dodd from Harvard Law School, who took the position that corporations should promote social interests. So the business corporation is an economic institution which has a social service. So these two views kind of mark out the wide breadth of this debate. And you know, in recent years, what I would think of as the Business Roundtable and the Larry Fink position has been piled on by a number of important authors. So Rebecca Henderson at Harvard Business School, I should say, wrote a book called Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. Alex Edmonds at the University of Oxford, Colin Meyer as well. I'm sorry, Alex, I think is at the London Business School. Colin, I think, is at the University of Oxford. So all of them kind of putting forward books, making clear the importance of corporations doing what's best for society, but in order to grow the pie, as Alex Edmonds says, to do what's best, not just for stakeholders, but also for investors. And so another view, which we think has gotten less attention, but it is the focus of our paper, is one that's been put forward by Oliver Hart. Here's Oliver receiving the Nobel Prize for Economics several years ago, and Luigi Zingales. Here is Luigi when he was the president of the American Finance Association. And Oliver and Luigi have said that companies and asset managers should pursue policies consistent with the preferences of their investors. They should figure out what their investors want them to do, and they should do that. So that's the position that we investigate. And we try and put some information to that. What do investors actually want? Before we go on to actually look at that question, I want to point out an important factor that arises or that comes out of this debate. So this is the trade-off between returns and social interests. And so if you look at the position of Milton Friedman and then Jamie Dimon in the Business Roundtable and Larry Fink, their view that you can promote social interests to maximize returns, this suggests that it's possible to do both. And if that's the case, we argue that the decision of corporate managers is very easy. You should simply do both. You should pursue social interests that will maximize value for investors, and everybody will be happy. Nobody's going to argue with your decision. But we also argue that this is a somewhat Panglossian view of the world, that there can't only be decisions that maximize social interests and financial interests. So what about actions that maximize social value, but don't maximize returns? An easy way of thinking about this is, what if a corporation wants to spend more on a social interest than would maximize its profits? Imagine there's a level of, say, environmental sustainability that maximizes profits. What if they want to go further? Imagine that there's a level of investor compensation, of employee compensation, worker compensation that maximizes profits. What if they want to go further than that? In that case, they're not doing both. So this Larry Fink, Jamie Dimon position is out of contention. And this then becomes a hard question about what companies should do in this circumstance. But this is the situation that we focus on, because we think it's the more interesting and the only one that actually presents a challenging question for corporate leaders and for investment managers. So let me now move on to talking about what our research questions are. And the first one is this question of how much investors are willing to sacrifice for social interests. And as I said, what we're doing is trying to put empirical evidence behind the question raised by Oliver Hart and Luigi Zingales. So previous surveys in this area have indicated that investors have some willingness to sacrifice financial returns for social interests. Arno Riedel and Paul Smeets in the Netherlands have found that, as have some others. But the works that come up with this conclusion generally don't provide monetary interests to the participants. And we believe that this means that maybe this is just cheap talk on the part of participants in these surveys. They could be virtue signaling their intention to do this, but when there's actually money on the line, perhaps they won't. There's one exception to this, which is a recent study by several professors at MIT, which does actually conduct an experiment, and we follow in their footsteps to an extent. But what we do is we try and set up our experiment to bear more resemblance to actual investing conditions. The second question that we look at is how do individuals' pro-social preferences differ between different channels? And by different channels, I mean when individuals are investing, when they're making consumption decisions about what to purchase, and when they're making donation decisions. So one reason to look at this is because Milton Friedman suggested that rather than companies making decisions about which social interest to pursue, the companies could distribute their returns to their investors, and the investors can then decide for themselves. So this then goes to the question, do investors prefer money gets spent through the company, through a corporate channel, or do they prefer to do it directly through donations? And many investors, including Oliver and Luigi, have assumed that investment preferences of beneficial investors are the same as their consumption preferences. So they use examples from decisions about which products to buy, the fact that individuals are willing to buy socially responsible products such as fair trade coffee, to conclude that investors will be willing to do the same. And there's extensive work documenting a certain willingness to pay more for some products that promote social goods, but there hasn't been prior work that compares these three different channels of decision making. So we believe that we make a contribution there. And then our third question is, how do pro-social preferences differ among investors? So that is, what are the characteristics of individuals that are associated with their willingness to sacrifice for social interests? So there's been extensive work in the field of philanthropy on why individuals give and who gives. And some of the factors that people have come up with is their generation, suggesting that millennials may be willing to contribute more, their age, their gender, their political affiliation. So we look at each of these factors and determine and see if we can observe any relationships between them and the willingness to sacrifice in these three different channels we look at. All right, so how do we conduct our study? So our participants come from a survey organization called Qualtrics. We limit it to US residents over the age of 18 and those who have had some previous investing experience. And we ran an experiment in February of this year. So the way that it worked was that each participant was asked to complete a survey, and we had 3 separate surveys. So there was an investment survey, a consumption survey, and a donation survey. And we made them all as similar as we possibly could. And here's the important part. Each of our participants was asked to complete one of the 3 surveys. So what we end up with is a group of about 80 to 90 participants who did the investment survey, a different group of 80 to 90 that did consumption, and a different group of 80 to 90 that did donations. Now, because we selected them randomly, we believe that the composition of these 3 groups is likely to be the same. And that's going to be the basis for many of our inferences that we draw comparing the preferences in investment decisions and consumption decisions and donation decisions. Okay, so to give you a sense of how the survey worked, let's talk about we'll focus on the investment portfolio, and then I'll explain how the other 2 surveys differed from investment. So participants were told that they had a virtual investment account of $40,000. And then they were asked 4 sets of 10 questions. And each set related to $10,000. And each set related to a trade-off between investing in a general portfolio and a socially responsible portfolio. And so we had 4 different socially responsible portfolios. Each one was related to gender diversity, 1 to income equality, 1 to environmental protection, and 1 to faith-based values. And then we randomized the order in which they appeared for the participants. And we also had an attention check question. So after 2 of these blocks of 10 questions, we would ask the participants, what was the socially responsible portfolio in the last set of questions, and we would see if they remembered what it actually was. And then we ended up taking out the individuals that can't remember that on the basis that they're not really paying attention to our survey. So what do the actual decisions look like? In each of the questions, the individuals were asked, would they prefer to invest in the general portfolio with a 10% return or the socially responsible portfolio with, say, a 9.9% return? So the 10% return is going to stay fixed in all of the 10 questions in the set. And then the 9.9% is going to vary. So the next question will be almost identical, but with a lower return. And so we do the same for 8, 7, all the way down to 1%. And the idea is we're trying to figure out what's their equilibrium point, what's their trade-off point where they're willing to stop giving to socially responsible portfolios and instead accept the general portfolio that doesn't do anything for social interests. And in this, we're building on studies that use these similar multiple price list procedures to get participants time value of money, the amount that they're willing to receive for delaying payments into the future. Here's an example of our question. You have $10,000 to invest in some combination of two portfolios, the general portfolio or an environmentally friendly portfolio. And then please choose your preferred option. Invest in the general portfolio with a 10% return or the environmental protection responsible portfolio with a 7% return. And then we would spell out exactly how much they would make in each of these two situations and ask them which of the two they prefer. Okay, so that's the investment survey. And the other channels varied only in very minor ways, the minimum necessary to make it semantically meaningful for these other decisions. So in the consumption scenario, they were told they had a purchasing account, 4 sets of $10,000, and that they would buy from suppliers, either a general set of suppliers or socially responsible suppliers, where the socially responsible suppliers would be more expensive. So if they buy from the socially responsible suppliers, they have less money left over, they have less savings. If they buy from the general portfolio, they have more savings. And then donation, we just said you have $10,000. How much would you like to give away and how much would you like to keep with respect to these 4 different kinds of charities working for the same 4 social interests? And of course, if you don't donate the money, then you have more money left over. So we set up a set of incentives for the individuals. We pay them rewards, and then we also donate money to actual registered charities in the United States based on their answers to the questions. So for every $1,000 a participant decides not to sacrifice, we pay them a bonus of $1 up to $4. And we also give them a lottery number, a chance to win $100 that we draw afterwards and we give to one participant. And in this, we think this is, in some ways, it's channeling an element of risk into the situation in a very limited way. And then for every $1,000 they did sacrifice, we donated $1 to a registered charity. We collect a variety of personal information: age, gender, location, education, political preference, their investing experience, how often they make charitable donations, their risk preference, their beliefs about government regulation, and also about promoting certain social goods. And as I mentioned, we exclude individuals that fail our attention test, and we also exclude individuals that record inconsistent preferences. So if they say they would be willing to sacrifice $200 for a social interest, but not $100, because we think that that doesn't make rational sense. So we have 279 participants that passed the tests, and our sample is relatively balanced. Very similar proportions of gender in each sample, age, income, and political affiliation. Okay, so that's how we conduct our study. Let's now move to what we find. So the first question, and the critical question for us, is how much are investors willing to sacrifice for social interests? So this is the main result that we come up with. And these are the amounts that individuals are willing to, the number of individuals in each group, the proportion of individuals in each group that chose to make each level of sacrifice for each of the 4 different social interests. So a couple of things that clearly stand out from these results. So first of all, the amounts, there's a substantial group in each case that aren't willing to sacrifice anything at all, that choose the absolute lowest level. I should mention here that what we do is we make a very conservative assumption about their willingness to sacrifice. We don't give them the option to sacrifice 0. So what we say is, if you choose not to sacrifice 10, then maybe you're willing to sacrifice up to just below $10. And so we assume that people that say no to all of the questions might be willing to sacrifice $10, $9.9, which we round up. But there's this large group that fall into the lowest possible category that aren't willing to even sacrifice the lowest possible amount that we give them the option to do. But there's also this group, and it varies between about 40 and 60%, depending on the particular social interest, that are willing to sacrifice some amount. And that sacrifice kind of is distributed across the different levels, right up to the top amount that we gave them the option to sacrifice. So here are the means for the 4 levels. Gender diversity is, faith-based values have the lowest amount, followed by gender diversity. You can see that they're all relatively consistent. You can see also that for each of these, the median category is usually the 10%, the $10 category, or the $100 category. The mean is higher than that. It's skewed by these larger amounts that individuals are willing to sacrifice. So what we conclude is that participants are willing to sacrifice some monetary gains to promote social interests, but there's a significant proportion that aren't willing to sacrifice even the smallest amounts. And we should note that these are likely to be the upper bounds of investors' willingness to sacrifice, partly because, as I said, we round up, also because we offer a guaranteed return of 10%. Actual returns are likely to be less, especially, and they're unlikely to be guaranteed in the equity markets. So then, with respect to our second research question, which is how do individuals' pro-social preferences differ between different channels? So these are our results for the 3 different channels and the 4 different social interests. And the first thing to note here is that the means are all significantly greater than 0. So in each channel, they're willing to sacrifice some amount. The next thing to note is that the investment amounts are almost always lower than the consumption amounts or the donation amounts. The one exception is this situation here for environmental protection, where investors are more or less willing to sacrifice the same when they're investing and when they're donating. But in every other case, individuals are less willing to sacrifice when they're investing than when they're buying or when they're donating. Of particular interest, there's a particularly large difference for the faith-based values question, social interest. And so individuals, this was the second highest amount that individuals were willing to sacrifice, I should say the highest amount that individuals were willing to sacrifice in the donation condition. but the lowest amount they were willing to sacrifice in the investment condition. We also run a factor analysis, and this is to try and capture an underlying willingness to sacrifice, which we believe is being manifested in each of these different channels and for each of the different interests. The things to note here is that it just backs up what I showed on the previous slide, that there's a difference. The investment condition is lower than the donation condition and is also significantly lower than the consumption decision. Okay, and this just backs up, provides the same information with respect to participants that aren't willing to sacrifice at all across these 3 different conditions. And for all of the 4 different interests, the investment condition individuals, there's a greater percentage of individuals that aren't willing to sacrifice anything when they're investing than when they're making the other 2 sets of decisions, with one exception with respect to environmental protection, where again, investment and donation is more or less the same. So from all of this, we conclude that channels of decision-making matter, that participants sacrifice less when they're investing than when they're consuming or when they're donating. So this goes along with this Friedman idea that maybe corporations shouldn't be making social interest decisions themselves, but maybe individuals might prefer to make those themselves. Also, the differences suggest that investment preferences aren't driven solely by a general willingness to sacrifice. If that were the case, you would expect all of these 3 different conditions to be more or less the same. So there, again, channels of decision-making matter. And it also suggests that our participants aren't simply looking through the experiment to the amount that they're going to make in absolute rewards. That what's actually going on is they are taking the scenario that we give them seriously. Okay, and then our third question that we look at is, how do pro-social preferences differ among investors? And so this is 3 different ordinary least squared regressions, 3 different models with a different number of factors included, showing the extent to which the factor of their willingness to sacrifice is predicted by each of these demographic characteristics. A couple of things to note, just echoing what I already said, the investment channel is significant in all models, and it's less than consumption or donation. Secondly, age is only marginally significant. We looked into age a little bit more. I'm happy to talk about that if people have interests, but really the relationship with age is more complicated and it doesn't show up as significant here. What does show up as significant is gender. Women are more willing to sacrifice than men, and income, marginally significant. Greater income leads to a greater willingness to sacrifice, and political affiliation also matters. Democrats in the United States, that is left-leaning individuals, are more willing to sacrifice than those that are right-leaning or independent. Here's another view of the political affiliation. Again, greater willingness to sacrifice for those in the United States identifying as Democrats, less for the others. And this is particularly strong in the investment condition compared to the 2 other conditions. We also look at individuals' beliefs regarding the efficacy of socially responsible investment. And the main point here is that only 30% of participants believe that socially responsible investment is not at all effective or rarely effective. 70% believe that it's effective sometimes or more often than that. And yet we still see these results. A few words about our limitations of the study. Obviously, external validity. Real world investors are going to be very different from the ones in our study. Partly they're going to be different individuals than those that Qualtrics may recruit. They'll have greater real payoffs. They won't have guaranteed returns. They'll probably have lower returns than we were offering them in our study. We attempt to alleviate these as much as we can, but it's the nature of doing experimental research that if you try and control the setting, you can't control, you make this less realistic. We also don't control risk preferences. We isolate out willingness to sacrifice in order to focus on that. And we don't explicitly consider investors' views on the efficacy of social responsibility, of that is, of how much money they're giving away, how much it's actually likely to move these social interests forward. All right, so moving now to what we see as the implications for our study. And I'll divide these into the implications for corporate leaders and for investment managers. So for corporate leaders, the fact that we show that some investors prefer to sacrifice a non-zero amount shows that taking responsible actions that maximize returns may not be enough. So if Jamie Dimon and Larry Fink say, only do what's necessary to maximize profits, there's a substantial group of investors that would like them to do more. Second, and perhaps most critically, is the heterogeneity in investor preferences about social interests creates really difficult problems for corporate leaders. Whose preferences should they follow? The substantial group that prefer that they give away nothing at all, or those that would prefer that they do sacrifice some amount? How much should they sacrifice? And with respect to which particular purposes, because investor preferences will vary among these different preferences, as we've shown. How should they figure out investor preferences? And then once they figure out a proportion of investors that want to do one thing and that want to do the other, what should the decision rule be? Should it be a majority of investors? Should it be unanimity? No matter what they decide, they'll have some investors who will inevitably be disappointed. And the main point of our study, we believe, is that these questions can't be avoided, that it's not enough just to say, we will do what maximizes shareholder value in order to promote social interests, that there are going to be some questions where there are trade-offs, where these difficult decisions will have to be reckoned with. Second, implications for investment managers. How should they attempt to influence corporate leaders? And so they're going to face similar complications as the corporate leaders themselves. Their advantage is that they can much more easily ascertain their own investors' preferences. So an investment manager like BlackRock or Vanguard has a contractual relationship with its own investors, and it has their contact information. Its internal groups can reach out to them and can find out what their preferences are, either acting on its own or with working with investors, with researchers like ourselves. And we would be delighted to work with any of these organizations to try and figure out what their actual investors believe, to try and get a little bit closer to the answer to this question. So they're also going to face the question of how much of their own investors' returns should they be willing to sacrifice. But here, investment managers may face legal rules that prevent them from actually sacrificing value. Certainly in the United States, investment managers that invest retirement savings that are regulated under ERISA pension plans have limitations on what they can do. And it's also the case in other jurisdictions as well. However, some investors will prefer them to make these sacrifices. So that casts into question the value of these rules. So finally, is it enough for the investment manager to disclose their approach and let investors choose? And my hope is this is something we can possibly raise in our discussion. So to conclude, we find that investors are willing to sacrifice some amounts to promote social interests, but many investors aren't willing to sacrifice anything. Investors are less willing to sacrifice in investment decisions than in donation or consumption decisions. And there's significant heterogeneity in their preferences, both among social interests and in ways that are associated with gender and political affiliation. And so there's no clear consensus that corporations should maximize value and returns. And there's also no clear consensus about how much they should sacrifice to promote social interests. And this raises challenging questions for corporate leaders and investment managers, but questions that unfortunately they can't avoid. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. That was fascinating. We are now going to turn to our commentator, Dean Paatsch. And Dean has had, been up close and personal to these issues in the Australian context. So over to you, Dean.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. And thanks both to Scott and you for the opportunity to respond to some of the issues that have been raised in this very timely and I think important paper. So I'm a practitioner, and in the course of my job at advising institutional investors on governance issues in Australian listed companies, I spend a lot of my time trying to work out exactly what their attitudes and preferences are on governance issues. So this paper is really good for me because it unpacks the idea that there's no such thing as an homogenous investor or a cohort of the same on ESG issues. That idea absolutely chimes with me. It never ceases to amaze me that what's a material issue to one investor won't even feature in the investment decision-making of another. From our position, because we're a profit-making business with demanding clients, we're incentivized to try and walk both the principled and middle ground, identifying governance and accounting issues that matter and encouraging our clients to use that information or to apply it in their own and their end investing clients' enlightened self-interest. So what I really like about Scott and his co-authors' approach is that they frame their analysis in terms of trade-offs in much the same way that investors might think about risk and return. And in my experience, these trade-offs are just as true in relation to social responsibility. There are seldom purist positions in investment markets. Everyone has a price for their own willful blindness. So Scott's fundamental question is, do investors care about social responsibility? And like most good questions, the answer is, it depends. For institutional investors, the trade-offs are not simply the classic risk versus return trade-off through the dimension of time, either short or long term. Institutions care about social responsibility if it affects their own P&L, their own hip pocket, their own bottom line. If their investment style is sold on the basis of principles, it can be a business-ending experience to be caught with an overweight position in a stock that's subsequently revealed to be an anathema to what's being marketed. Other investors with, say, an absolute return focus care in different ways. Those, for instance, who profit from shorting stocks on ESG issues, they have no interest in preventing social irresponsibility. Rather, they care about being set so they can privatise the benefit when a catalyst exposes miscreant behaviour. The dominant investing force de jour is indexing investing. And for this group, caring about social responsibility doesn't involve your typical trade-offs because their investment universe is defined to an observable benchmark that's determined by someone else. You have to hold the stock, whether it's a tobacco company whose product has no safe level of use and will kill 1/3 of its consumers who use it long term, or if they're investing in a solar panel maker capitalising on the shift away from fossil fuels. Caring to this group is sometimes a cynical exercise in product differentiation, or a recognition that for a group so ostensibly powerful, they are powerless to withhold their investors' capital and are instead left with the soft power of persuasion to reflect their customers' preferences to manage their money for the long term. In the Australian context, for say an industry super fund or an asset aggregator, balancing these competing interests is a tightrope walk. They're a little of everything. They're an index fund, an active manager, and they'll employ hedge funds. They're protected by defined fund flows, which presents its own challenges. And it's interesting that they're defining their customer promise to explicitly include socially responsible issues. And in some cases, their own customers are pushing them and holding them to account on these issues. So Scott's research is novel in that it considers the trade-offs that an individual investor makes when considering investment decisions with a socially responsible bent. And as the research progresses, and I'm sure this will just be the first step down a long path, it's likely to be useful to both institutional investors and corporations. I would point out that for individual investors, finding an agent to implement your ESG preferences presents as a classic information problem. There's little in the way of useful disclosure to distinguish between investors who say they care about these issues compared to those who show they care. There's a big distinction, and enduring relationships normally involve people showing through their actions that they care. So there's some food for thought for regulators too, in terms of what disclosure, aside from marketing puffery, that will allow investors to judge whether what they are being sold is indeed what they're being bought. I was struck by some of the findings in the paper. It's really notable how large the cohort was. It was 32%, that didn't want any truck with social responsibility at all in the investment condition and weren't prepared to sacrifice return whatsoever. This poses a very tricky balancing act to design one size fits all portfolios for the remainder of the group who express preference for some trade-off, albeit on a sliding scale. This is a classic optimization problem, one familiar to most in portfolio construction. But the paper is really useful in that it reframes optimization in terms of giving voice to investor preferences on social issues, rather than purely in terms of risk and return. I liked the design of the experiment. It was very neat to contrast the investment return sacrifice with both the consumption and the donation decisions. And this was a great launching pad to test preferences along the lines of that Friedman framework, where he argues that investors receiving the benefit of the focus on financial returns from business are free to set up their own preferences either as consumers or donors and spend that money however they want there. It also, to my mind, set up a lovely distinction with some earlier studies that just assume tight correlations between investment conditions and consumption behaviours. This is a much more sophisticated and approach that uses choice modelling. And for those of you who've done any product design, it's very useful and will be very useful to any investment managers on the call. I also thought using the demographic information as explanatory variables was a cool approach, though I do admit to being a little bit confused about the finding that rich women Democrats were more willing to donate to social causes that were conservative. So I wasn't sure whether this meant that Hillary Clinton was more likely to donate to the National Rifle Association than become a member of them. I didn't quite know how to interpret that. I had lots of questions about the design of the experiment. I've peppered Scott with some of those in the last few days, some of which were addressed in the paper, and I'm sure some will be addressed in future iterations. I didn't quite understand both how and why the factors were reweighted to create a single willingness to sacrifice factor, whether that could have been overcome by a larger sample size. Personally, I'd love to test investors' preferences on social responsibility in terms of them spending a risk budget rather than simply in terms of a return sacrifice. Equally, I was dying to know whether the outcomes would have been influenced by an investor's starting risk preference or risk appetite, and whether those appetites would affect trade-offs across any of the investing, consumption, and donation decisions. So I'm confident that this will just be the starting point in a much longer journey for Scott and his co-authors in inquiring and examining these issues. To finish though, it did give me cause to think as to whether US corporate law in particular is in any way reflecting this larger debate. The all-pervasive effects of Delaware law and the prevalence of the honest idiot defense, the business judgment rule, suggests that it's hardwired there that there'll be no consequence to ignoring investor preferences. Perhaps the most effective way for investors to affect pro-social change is to focus on the incentives of the CEO to harness their self-interest for the common good. Although the recent Exxon board push, where a very small pro-environment hedge fund garnered 2 seats, also emphasises the fundamental importance of, quite aside from giving effect to people's preferences, it's fundamentally important that we protect the market for corporate control and ensure that there's equal access, proxy access in the US market, so that that serves as the ultimate discipline to those who ignore investor preferences. Thanks for the opportunity to get an insight into to this paper, and I look forward to continuing the discussion.
Dean, thank you so much. And we're all going to turn on our videos at this point. Tim, if you can join us as well. And I'm just going to throw it back to Scott to respond to Dean's comments. Is there anything that you want to ask Dean or you'd like to respond to there?
Absolutely, Jennifer. First of all, I want to thank Dean for a really excellent set of comments. Dean's comments, I think, make clear, but also Dean's questions to me offline indicate how thoroughly he engaged with this paper, and really down to a very granular level that I think speaks volumes about Dean, and for which we're incredibly grateful for. He indeed went easy on me. He did have some, as he put it, questions, curly methodological questions, more than he revealed in his comments. That some of them are things that we address in the paper, but haven't really explained very well in the paper. Others are things that I think we really need to go back and think about. And Dean, I think this question about risk preference is really critical. We kind of overlooked this in the hope to try and, out of, I think, a fear that if we introduce that in this study as well, it might get too complicated. But having talked to Dean offline, I think I now have some ideas about how to implement that. And, I think we weren't sure we were going to find anything with this paper. We're really glad we did find something. And now that we did, I think we can add on that extra layer of risk preferences and see if these things hold constant, see how it changes people's views, take into account what people actually think about the riskiness of social responsibility. Do they think it's less risky or more risky to take into account these factors? And, what are their return expectations, which I think are likely to change our results. And I hope that we can actually find some tractable results with that in a future paper.
But can I just ask you, when you started this project, the sort of your assumed results, did they differ greatly from the results that you got? Were there things about your results that really surprised you from when you thought this would be an interesting thing to explore? Or were they, did you assume that there would be this great diversity in investor choice and preference, etc.? We
didn't really go into it with a strong view either way. Like I think we can now, it's tough for me to kind of separate out. We pre-registered all of our hypotheses. And I think this was one of our exploratory hypotheses. On some of them, we expected political affiliation to have a strong influence. That seemed fairly clear to us. And so that wasn't a big surprise. When we initially set this up, we hadn't been thinking about taking donations into account. And in a comment, as we were presenting this to some people to try and figure out our methodology, said, well, you really need to look at this to see, is this all being driven by just a general willingness to give to these causes? So we put that in as well. And I think it's kind of become a really important finding that we've come up with, that it is different just from donation decisions. And this, as Dean put it, the Friedman perspective, the kind of the separation of channels. So I think we were surprised by how clearly that came through. I think we weren't sure that we were going to find significant results, that it might have all just kind of been in the middle, that we wouldn't be able to separate things, and that we did, even with these fairly weak experimental incentives. We were delighted by that we were actually able to find something.
Scott, you mentioned the Burley-Dodd debate in the beginning of your presentation in framing your study. And I always find it quite interesting that Burley and Dodd are about the only academics I know that later completely flipped positions and said the other guy got it right and they got it wrong. And both of them thought that, they were wrong. So Dodd said, well, I thought corporations could just be socially responsible. They can't, you need hard government regulation. And Burley said, well, I thought we should just, corporations should only be making money for shareholders. And then 20 years down the track, he said that was totally wrong. They should be completely socially responsible, like Dodd said. So I always found that quite amusing. We've got a couple of questions from the audience, and then I know Tim's got a couple of questions too, but then you and Dean can chat as well. So one from James W. I don't know what the W stands for. Thanks for this interesting presentation. How does this study sit with the hypothesis that some investors may expect that companies that deliver corporate social responsibility are likely to have greater and more sustainable returns in the long run, and therefore investors do not expect to sacrifice investment returns? In other words, that investors may form a view that carbon-intensive industries are not long-term winners. Any response to that, either Dean or Scott?
Maybe Dean, I can start, and I'd be interested to hear what you have to say as well. So first of all, James, thank you for the question. I think I spent some time trying to focus on this trade-off point, because I think this is a really intuitive question and a way to kind of respond to our paper, is it really a trade-off? What happens when there's not a trade-off? And I want to say that our paper doesn't speak to the situation where there isn't a trade-off. We acknowledge and think that in many cases, companies can do well by doing good. That the right thing to do is also the profitable thing to do in terms of how to treat employees, in terms of being socially responsible, obviously in terms of obeying the law, and that will, in many cases, increase returns, and that especially when you take risk into account, that for instance, on climate change, companies that are bearing in mind transition risk will, if they are taking into account climate change, they'll be reducing that risk. If they're not, if they're just trying to make the biggest buck they can right now, then maybe that's increasing their risks further down the line. So I think, James, we don't speak to that circumstance at all. What we do instead is we say that there's a group of choices, and sadly, I think it's a larger group than corporate leaders would have us believe. I think an easy way of sidestepping the problem that we show in our paper is just to claim that doing good will always lead to greater returns. But we don't think that can always be the case. And even if a company is maximizing its profits by doing well, why not do a little bit more for the world? So there's always going to be that choice, and that's the trade-off that we're looking at. And I don't think we have too much to say about the situation where there isn't a trade-off, except that those situations are and should be easy for directors and corporate leaders to decide what to do because they can do both.
I only have one thing to add to that, and that is that, it's actually really like a fundamental question, but that we need to look at it through the dimension of risk. And the limitation of the paper, which you acknowledge up front, is that people aren't spending a risk budget in making any of those trade-offs. They're spending their return budget. And, it clearly, is one of the questions of the day, is that, can we design portfolios that have similar levels of risk, yet have similar expectations of return and deliver on the investors' preferences for the pro-social piece. So I don't think anyone's quite cracked that, but it was sort of beyond the limitation of the paper.
Right, Jennifer, I'll jump in here and raise the next question that comes from Bruce Dyer, because it chimes with something I've been thinking about. And Bruce, thanks both Scott and Dean for their presentations, and then asks, to what extent do they think investor preferences will differ in different countries and cultures? And if they do, what are the implications of cross-border investment in this area? And in Australia, some of the more vocal investors about ESG issues are offshore investors. So BlackRock's been mentioned, Standard Aberdeen, for example, and other jurisdictions see what seems to be imported ESG activism. The Nordic funds, for example, staged a prominent intervention against one of the Japanese banks last year. And so I guess the question to both Dean and Scott is, do you see differences here in how offshore versus onshore investors are dealing with these issues? And I guess, it adds an extra complication if the offshore investors' ultimate beneficiaries have, further diverse perspectives. It's adding an extra level of diversity on an existing level of diversity. So I wonder if you have any comments on that issue.
I might bounce the ball, certainly from an Australian perspective. Yeah, airlifting in particularly US corporate governance standards into Australia does jar. The US environment is very different, and I think that reflects both the corporate law environment there, but also investor preferences. So it's really difficult. There's no one set of investor preferences. It's very difficult for directors and managers to navigate that. What is, if I'm looking at, say, for instance, a expectation about how to design a executive pay package. In the US, it's a free-for-all of, hurdle-free options, whereas in Australia, we would expect, quite demanding performance conditions, genuinely looking at outperformance. US investors will generally wade through anything. Size is not a problem, whereas in Australia, it's, there's quite different expectations. So, yeah, it's real, and I think what is true though is that the size of the pool does relate to influence. So, we've seen this emergence of Larry Fink and all of these other people who are, banging the drum on their philosophies about social responsibility without having received very much scrutiny about whether they are actually walking the talk. So, that's just a few comments. Scott?
Tim, I would add, so I think it's difficult to know on the question of how do ultimate beneficial investors think about this in different jurisdictions or countries. And it's something we would love to do, is to do a cross-country comparison of Australian investors, European investors, English, Japanese investors, and see what they would actually like to, what their preferences are there differences? Because you see what you can observe is the actions of the institutional investors in each of these environments, as you were referring to, and each of them has different levels of engagement and the preferences that they appear to be representing. So there's a question about, do those differ from what their underlying investors would actually prefer. And there's another layer, and I think this goes to, I think, both Tim and Dean, what you were alluding to, at least in the United States, it seems that some of the investment managers may be influenced in their views more by the large pools of assets, sometimes large pools of assets that are coming from outside the United States, from the European pension funds, from the Japanese pension fund, that are causing US institutional investors, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, to skew their own policies to try and capture that business. As Dean said, and I think it rings very true, it's not something we really look at in this paper, but it's something I've worked on in some other papers, is the agency problems of investment managers, is how their incentives may differ from their underlying investors. And that, Tim, I think that's definitely something that you can kind of observe anecdotally from what's happening.
Yeah, great.
Jennifer, do you want to ask another question? Or I was going to just mention, we have a question here from Malaysia, from Dr. Loganathan Krishnan. It's a very broad question. I think we'd need to write a book to answer it for you appropriately. But I might just flip it to Dean. The question was, what are the regulatory requirements for corporate social responsibility in Australia? And I might just ask you, Dean, reframe that a little. Do you think that Australia, has firm regulatory requirements in this regard? Some countries like India have very strong requirements in this regard, but how do you think Australia sits generally in terms of actual laws?
It's a big question. I mean, how you define corporate social responsibility. One thing I can say is that the disclosures of particularly listed companies are wildly variable. So if I go back to that sort of information problem that investors might have in determining whether their own agents are giving expression to their preferences, the same information problem exists in relation to investment managers being able to observe whether companies themselves are, socially responsible in some sort of normative sense, because there's no obligation on people to make complete disclosures on every issue. So, if you just take one example, which is, a huge example, and that is, exposure to carbon risk, level 1, level 2, level 3, or scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, there are widely varying disclosures in the Australian market. So it's a classic information problem, and no one has solved for that yet. Governance is a little different because, we have very good disclosures, very well trafficked in police laws, but even then there are lots of, spaces in between. So
yeah, thanks. And one thing in the last couple of years in Australia that's really captured attention has been the memorandum that was written by Barrister Noel Hutley and Sebastian Hartford Davis on the potential for directors to be liable for breach of duty of care for not recognising climate change risks in making decisions. Tim, you've got another question, I think.
Yeah, it's from David Friedrich. I hope I've pronounced the surname correctly.
Friedrich.
So David's question is, may I follow up on Dean's comment about what people do versus what they say and tie that to political affiliation? Please excuse his Canadian scepticism, but to what extent does the study take into account the Hawthorne effect? And I'm not quite sure what that is, and American Democrats' effort to virtue signal. So probably
that's one for you, Scott.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, David, thank you for the question. I think it's a kind of a good methodological question that one should think about for anyone conducting an experiment. So the Hawthorne effect, the basic idea that individuals are likely to change their behavior when they're being observed and when they know that they're being observed with respect to any particular factor. So I think it's something that's unavoidable in experiments. I guess that the only way would be to kind of camouflage the situation. And so others have done that in other circumstances. It's not something that we did in the study or even tried to do, really. I think what you end up with is a trade-off between a kind of clarity and kind of identifying the behavior versus the possibility of the, as David mentions, the Hawthorne effect, that these individuals might be virtue signaling. So I think one response to that is that where there are incentives involved, then it may not actually be virtue signaling. It might be their real preferences. Another is that, so I guess the suggestion is when they're doing this, when they're investing in the privacy of their own homes, or when they're making consumption decisions in supermarkets or wherever they're buying their goods and services from, maybe this will be different. And, I think in some of those will also be observed. People's consumption decisions may actually be affected by the fact that they know individuals will see what it is that they're purchasing. But I think it's definitely a question of an issue for our external validity of the study with respect, especially to investing and donation, where these decisions in the real world aren't likely to be observed by others, and that therefore aren't likely to be strong virtue signals. Whereas in our experiment, clearly we are observing that. So I'm not sure, we would love to come up with a design to kind of get around this. And if anyone knows how, we would love to take some suggestions. But I think we think that's inevitable. And, I think we might share your skepticism on, how much this actually plays out, especially the political affiliation connection in the real world. But this is what we find.
Thanks. We did just have a suggestion pop up in the Q&A box from Dheeraj saying anonymous shareholder voting to find out what people really think. We've got one other question here from Karen Dickinson-Rowe about how these issues impact not-for-profit companies and scientific research supported by funding and donations. Do you see relevance for these issues in those two contexts? I think that question might have stumped our speaker and commentator. You're looking very thoughtful there.
To me, I think there is one of the possible normative takeaways is that there's a substantial group of individuals who think that these questions should be privately handled through nonprofit organizations. I mean, it's partly the way that we set up the experiment. So we didn't really give people the choice that this should be done through government. And it's something we would think about, we're thinking about doing possibly for the future, and trying to think about how we would set that up. The common response to the suggestion that corporations should be taking into account social interests is that we have governments to do just that, and they can fund things. And so I think this question, Karen's question, brings up the possibility, are there preferences that individuals have that private organizations respond to those questions rather than governments doing this? I hesitate to stray too far out of my field, but that's something that you see, at least in the United States, with respect to political views, that, a preference for small government and an idea that social ills should be responded to by private nonprofit organizations in a greater philanthropic sector. And it's possible that because we were using US participants, that maybe reflects their view. And I think that's a good reason why we would like to see if that's shared in other places as well.
Thanks so much, Scott. Just before we wrap up, and I thank our speakers and Tim for being involved in the panel discussion, I did just want to say, if this was not long enough for anyone, I wanted to let you know that Dr. Tim Bowley, my colleague from Monash Law School, will be teaching an intensive course called Regulating Shareholder Activism from the 15th of September. It's on from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. on 5 or 6 days, I think. Anyone can enroll in that. So this is your big chance to, find out about the corporate social responsibility activism at Exxon, etc., because Tim will be examining all those issues. Anything else you want to say about the course, Tim? I know it's going to be great, but...
No, only that it's really topical, as this presentation has just demonstrated. So I look forward to welcoming a whole lot of students and interested people to the course.
Yeah, so you don't have to do it as a degree, you can do it as a one-off, and I'm sure you get points. So if you look in the chat box, Ellie and Heather have put the link to it, or you can just email me if you're interested. But now, to wrap up, Scott and Dean, thank you so much. And Tim, thank you also for joining us this morning. I thought it was a fantastic discussion. It is an issue that is certainly not going to be going anywhere soon. Thank you to everybody who joined us in the audience. Thank you to our wonderful behind the scenes people, Ellie, Heather and Janice, for making it all go very smoothly. And we've got a couple more of these seminars later this year, so please, if you're not on our mailing list already, go onto the CLARS website, Centre for Commercial Law and Regulatory Studies, Monash Law School. Join up, and we hope to see you again at a future event. Thank you all so much.